Good evening, peoples. I'm Pastor Leia, and this here is Ginger Snap, my faithful sidekick. So welcome back to our living room for our Tuesday night Bible study series. We've been going through the Apostles, of which there are technically 12, but not necessarily 12 people, depending on which list you're reading. Last week we talked about a James, and tonight we're talking about another James. Because, the Bible wasn't confusing enough as it was. We needed to have two people named James just among Jesus's, close circle of friends. I guess it was a popular name. This James, son of Zebedee, as opposed to last week's James, son of Alphaeus, is often known as James the Greater, to distinguish him from James the Less. I kind of hope that wasn't the nickname their friends gave them, call them hey, Greater, hey, Less. That would be a terrible nickname. Anyway, if it were, James the Less at least would need better friends. Anyway, so he's called the Greater to tell them apart, probably because he was either older or taller than the other James, not necessarily because he was better or more important, although this James shows up in more stories in this book. Probably. There's definitely a handful of times where, the writer just talks about James. Which James? James, son of Alphaeus, James, son of Zebedee, James, the brother of Jesus, who maybe is also James, son of Alphaeus, another person entirely. Who knows? It's confusing because there are, multiple people with this name. So this one is the brother of John. So it's a bit more helpful here because they tend to be in the same sentence. James and John doing something you can probably assume is James the brother of John and his brother John. So that's more helpful. So not to be confused with other James or other James or any other Jameses, which, isn't. Anyway, so in Greek and Latin, his name is something more like Jacobos. So I don't understand how Jacobos becomes James in English, which doesn't necessarily make sense to me, but I'm sure linguistically there was a whole thing. Anyway, I only made that connection a few years ago, and then suddenly I was like, oh, that's why Santiago is St. James. I get it now. Or Iago in Othello is another version of the same name, So anyway, that also explains how Santiago refers to St. James, because it comes from sancti in Latin, which is church or sanctuary. It's important to pronounce the N, the C, and the T in sancti. I love Latin, it's beautiful. So anyway, Santiago then would be Church of James, basically. My brain jumps to Santiago in Chile before it jumps to Santiago in Spain, but Santiago in Spain is probably more well-known. We'll be getting to that in a moment. So anyway, he's got a number of appearances in the Bible, including the story that I just read this past Sunday, actually, which I just read, so I won't read it again. And I think this story came up maybe a couple months ago. I feel like I was writing about it somewhat recently. So the request of James and John is an interesting one. In another gospel, it's their mother making the request. So in Mark 10:35, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. It's helpful that the author is really clarifying exactly which James we're talking about here. Came forward to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Yeah, it's not a big ask at all. Whatever we ask, anyway. And Jesus said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We're able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." The word of the Lord. It's such an interesting story to record. Definitely shows that even Jesus's closest friends don't necessarily understand what's going on in Jesus' head or why Jesus is here, which is very much a recurring theme throughout all of the Gospels and, for that matter, throughout all of Christian history. So, another story, which is the traditional story for 2 Sundays from now, the last Sunday before Lent, is the story of the Transfiguration, which is such a great scene for art. It's really just visual storytelling. So from Luke 9:28. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus, he just did the feeding of the 5,000 and was talking about like, hey, friends, I'm going to die, but then I'm going to be resurrected. And his friends are like, you're going to, what now? Anyway, conversations with Jesus must have been truly surreal. So about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James. We assume that it's James, son of Zebedee, again, because he's in the same breath as John and James. So it's probably the brothers, John and James. And went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory, and the 2 men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. This is the word of the Lord. Such a very visual, dramatic story. And I love the voice of God coming down like the voice of God came down at Jesus' baptism to say, This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. And now the voice of God comes down to say, This is my son, listen to him. Which, so great, the voice of God coming down. And then he shows up again in Acts, and again, helpfully is specified as James, the brother of John. So again, we know which James we're talking about. So in Acts 12:1, about that time, King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword. So only one of the apostles got to die of old age. So, James may have died first, according to various legends. We don't necessarily have like historical or biblical records of all of their deaths, but since they all have elaborate fan fiction stories of where they ended up preaching and how they ended up dying and where their bodies are, etc. Anyway, in that sort of timeline, he is believed to be the first apostle to die, other than Judas, who I guess we don't count him. We'll deal with him later. He dies in like 44 AD, depending on which king. So according to legend, his body was then either taken to Spain or he was placed in a boat by himself. So no person guiding the boat and no rudders or sails, but the boat with his body in it ends up in Spain. So either way, he gets to Spain. And then, according to legend, his body is still in the church Santiago de Compostela, which is in Spain. There's also a version of the story where he ends up in France, I think. And so there's another church in France that's like, hey, we have the body of St. James. But the church in Spain is like, we have the body of St. James, and we're a more famous church. So maybe the French church has him, maybe the Spanish church, maybe neither church has him, or maybe they both have different pieces of him, or definitely pieces of somebody, but it's hard to be specific when we're talking about things that happened 2,000 years ago, like this person dying. Anyway, so the whole Camino de Santiago is a whole thing. I've got a couple of friends who have gone on this journey, including a couple from my DC church who got engaged while doing the Camino. So Pope Alexander VI, who happens to be my favorite pope, I will not get into why, because that's a overly long side tangent, I suspect. Anyway, he declared this Camino, which means walk, by the way, in Spanish, to be one of the 3 great pilgrimages of Christendom. So the 3 like big places to go for Christians are Santiago, Jerusalem, and Rome. Jerusalem obviously makes sense. Jesus hung out there. Rome makes sense in the history of the church, I guess, more so than the life of Jesus. But then Santiago in Spain, which is interesting that that's the 3rd like most important place. So there's apparently dozens of different routes to get to this big church in Spain. I don't know that I quite realized that. I know there's different points at which you can start, but I didn't, I think, realize until tonight that there's like dozens of different routes, so it's not like everybody is on the same road walking. Although apparently, technically, the definition of a pilgrimage is like from one's home to one's destination, so technically there's like literally infinite routes, but anyway. So usually starts, my understanding was that it usually starts at a place in France, but there's also a starting point in Spain or in Portugal. So my friends who got engaged in France and then biked the rest of the way. So there's all these specific rules for doing this pilgrimage, which is interesting. You have to walk a minimum of 100 kilometers, because obviously it's in Europe, so they use kilometers. But that's like 62 miles. I had to look that up. I was born in this country, can you tell? Or you can also do it by bicycle, like my friends did. If you bicycle, because of course that goes faster, you have to do more than the 100 kilometers, so you have to go 200 kilometers or like 120 miles. There are also services that like you can put your bag and everything in a car that will like drive to your next night's destination, and then you can just walk without your heavy backpack. You can be like camping along the way. There's all sorts of hostels where you can have a bed for the night with a whole bunch of other pilgrims doing the same route, which I definitely, in my circles, of course, have several friends who aspire to do this at some point. It would definitely be a very interesting trip. Would probably help if you spoke Spanish more than I do. Oops, sorry. Yeah, or at least French, I guess, or Portuguese. Anyway, I speak English and studied Biblical Greek and Hebrew, which are not necessarily helpful languages to be speaking in the modern world, since they're... Anyway, so there was a book that was published in the 1950s that made this whole pilgrimage route popular again. It had kind of dwindled in like the Middle Ages, because like the Black Death was a whole thing that happened, and I guess that it made people less inclined to leave their homes, which I think is pretty relatable, I would say. Yeah. And of course, various religious movements of the era, the Protestant Reformation, etc., it got a bit more complicated. But it used to be a very more common thing that people would go on these big pilgrimages to a famous church, such as Santiago de Compostela. And so people will come back with little souvenirs from the trip. In this case, it's usually a scallop shell, because apparently there's a lot of scallop shells like on the physical journey in that area of Spain. But this scallop shell is so associated with the journey to this church of St. James itself that it's become like an essential piece of imagery for the saint, and not just the walk to his church, which is so cool how those, like the Camino de Santiago is like a really big part of the cultural understanding of who St. James is, and that's how people most often like experience him. It's just the way that the historical person and this road trip have come together is It's quite interesting to me. Anyway, so people would come home with a scallop shell from this trip. Anyway, so yeah, there was a book that was published in the 50s that made this more popular again. So there's like whole charts of like how many people have gone on this trip throughout the years. So fun fact, in the year that I was born, like 3,500 people-ish rounded did the Camino. But in the year 2019, which was the most recent year that Wikipedia had statistics for, like 350,000 people did it. So it's just become 100 times more popular since I was born, which is just a big explosion in popularity, which is not entirely sure why it got 100 times more popular, but apparently it did. And in years when July 25th, which is his feast day, when that falls on a Sunday, that's an especially symbolically important year to go. So in those years when July 25th is a Sunday, even more people go than in other years, which is, anyway. So yeah, lots of scallop shells. And when also, when he shows up in this past Sunday's story, when we like meet him, he is going fishing. So, you know, like a seashell and like a fisherman, they make sense. It's not like, you know, a complete randomly non-associated image. It works. Yeah, so there's, like I said, there's also a church in France who claims to have the body of James. So his feast day is July 25th. And so these saints are also often patrons of different groups of people. So like in my circles, there are certain theologians or famous pastors that we especially look up to. Oh my gosh, have you read so-and-so's new book? Did you see the tweet? This is a thing in my circles. But I'm sure that in your circles, there are authors or experts that are particularly notable to you that you follow. And so these are like I don't exactly want to call them pop culture icons because they're a bit beyond pop culture, but that's the best thing I can come up with off the top of my head of like why certain saints are particularly important to certain groups of people. So because of the Camino de Santiago, St. James is the patron saint of pilgrims. This makes sense. He is very intimately associated with like the biggest Christian pilgrimage. And also laborers and horsemen, which, you know, kind of the same kind of journeying imagery makes sense. And like you're walking this trip, so it's somewhat accessible as long as you can like, you know, get to Europe. So he's also the patron saint of knights. There's this whole story about him defeating the Moors in Spain and like leading armies. The Moors are like a people from Africa. So there's lots of art where he's like trampling over the severed heads of African people, which is cool. Maybe not the sort of art that I would want to have in a church, but it's anyway. So he's also the patron saint of soldiers more generally because of this story. Quite specifically, and this makes sense, he's the patron saint of Spanish conquistadors because, you know, he was leading Spanish troops to defeat this people's group. So he's also the patron saint of blacksmiths. I assume that's because he's sometimes shown with a sword because of the, you know, the military story. He's also the patron saint of veterinarians. Maybe that's because he's also the patron saint of horsemen. I'm not. Some of these seem like a bit of a stretch to me, at least, because I don't come from a Catholic tradition that really follows these saints. So he's also the patron saint of sock makers. So I just want to show off my favorite pair of socks. You might recognize this cat face. This is my cat's face on a pair of socks that I was given for Christmas a few years ago because someone bought them for me. I personally did not go out and get socks with my cat's face on them. That would, anyway. I feel the need to justify this pair of socks. They're hilarious. It's my cat's face on socks. So if you're going on a long road trip, I would imagine it would be very important to have lots of thick, comfy socks, clean ones in particular. The one of the reasons why we have a big Socktober collection every year at the church is because when I worked for a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. with a lot of street homeless people, the most requested thing that we got was clean socks and underwear, because if you don't have access to laundry facilities, you really need to get those clean on a regular basis, because this population of people notoriously has like major foot issues and dental issues. So we also, anyway, that's a whole thing. The socks are important. It was my point. So especially if you're going to be walking, 62 miles, you're definitely going to want to pack a good number of socks for that trip. I keep calling it a road trip, which has a much more modern connotation than I'm really talking about here. Anyway, so he's also the patron saint against arthritis and rheumatism. I like to think that this is because it would be very hard to walk 62 miles if you had arthritis or rheumatism. It might not be for that reason. I don't know. So in art, he's usually shown with a shell, because he's just really, really associated with that scallop shell. And so all along the various routes on the Camino to the church, you'll see different variations of a shell, like on signs, like, hey, you're still going the right way, because we see the shell here. People might wear some kind of shell to show that they're going on this journey. People will come home with shells. Also, part of it is you've got this like a Camino passport, and so at each place that you spend the night, they like mark like where you've stayed and how far you've gone, because you're not considered to have officially taken this journey unless you walk at least 62 miles, regardless of what specifically your route is. So St. James also, again, because of this Camino, is often shown with pilgrim accessories, so like a staff or a big floppy hat to protect from the sun, a cloak, a knapsack, a gourd of water, and sometimes, most specifically in Spanish art, he's shown on horseback or with a sword, or trampling an African person, or literally riding his horse over their severed heads. I don't always know what goes through the mind of painters, especially in the... Anyway. Yeah, I'm not showing any art tonight. I didn't have time to put that together. But I just think it is so cool that we've added all of these stories to what we have in the Bible, because these 12 close friends of Jesus are obviously very important, and we wish that we knew more about them. But so many people have gotten this very close connection with him because they've gone on this journey. There's also a Martin Sheen movie called The Way that came out when I was in college, like 2010-ish maybe. That's a really good movie about Martin Sheen's character embarking on this journey. Really beautiful scenery also. I think it would be a very fun, maybe not necessarily fun, but like meaningful trip to go on. And also the fact that you're walking means that you're seeing things in a very different way, taking the journey very slowly. So we usually think of pilgrimages to, like, I don't know, see an Elvis museum, or see the school that your great-grandfather went to growing up. That sort of thing. They're usually a bit more, not the sort of thing that 350,000 people go to. So we still have an idea of pilgrimages in our understanding, even as like Presbyterians. But this specific pilgrimage has been a pretty big deal for kind of a while. Why do you have to go off and do things? What? Well, okay then. Gingersnap has a pilgrimage that she needs to go on right now. Probably to her food dish. Yeah, it's just so cool that we really, really want to understand Jesus, and one of the ways that we maybe can do that is by better understanding some of his closest friends, because let's be real, we're never going to fully understand Jesus. I'm including myself here. So yeah, this is St. James, not the other St. James, and not that other James either, or maybe the other James, because there's so many Jameses, and I still don't understand how we got James from Jacobus, but that's not necessarily the point. So we are going to be continuing with more apostles. I will not be leading this study next week, but we will be carrying on with them because there's a number of them and they have quite interesting stories. So good night, peoples. Until next time, on behalf of my cat, wherever it is that she's pilgrimaging to, is that the verb? I should have looked that up. Going on a pilgrimage to. So until next time, good night.